Well, Tesla's full self-driving 10.69 finally dropped last night, and we have access to the release notes. And as expected, it's a pretty big update. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So yes, it's early morning and I'm trying to wrap my brain around a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of new features here, so I'll do my best, but this is of course a first pass at the release notes. So I've looked at them obviously and thought about them, but I may not be perfect here, but I wanted to get this video out. And yes, I told you I owed you an Ashok Elluswamy video about occupancy networks, which actually touch on some of the things that are actually in these release notes. So I'll have that later today if possible, but I wanted to get this one out first because it takes precedence. And also I'm going to reference Chuck Cook's video that he did, sort of a first drive with the full self-driving beta 10.69, and I'll have some screen grabs for that, but of course I will put a link to that video in the description and I highly recommend that you watch that. So anyway, this is from notateslaapp.com, got these release notes. I'm going to assume that they are correct. I don't have actual photographic evidence of this off of somebody's screen, and of course I don't have this yet. It looks like only a very few people got it last night. So, you know, Elon kept his promise. It came out for 8:20-ish, but didn't come to a lot of people yet. So anyway, if you recall, the release should go something like 10.69 this week, 10.69.1 next week, which will go from about 1,000 users to about 10,000 users, and then 10.69.2 in a couple of weeks. That will go to the full self-driving beta fleet, which is approximately 100,000 users. So that's the kind of rollout. I do not expect to get the very first version of it and haven't seen it yet. So, but I'm hoping to get 10.69.1 next week. And, you know, I don't expect a lot of differences in the release notes for that. I expect it will probably be the same. They'll just be tweaking a bunch of things and testing out stuff that people may not have had just right. So anyway, let's take a look at this. So FSD Beta 10.69 release notes. The first ones are actually fairly understandable. Then it gets kind of deep later on. So we will take a look here. All right. But anyway, their very first, release note is added a new, quote, deep lane guidance module to the vector lanes neural network, which fuses features extracted from the video streams with course map data, i.e. lane counts and lane connectivities. This architecture achieves a 44% lower error rate on lane topology compared to the previous model, enabling smoother control before lanes and their connectivities becomes visually apparent. This provides a way to make every autopilot drive as good as somebody driving their own commute, yet in a sufficiently general way that it adapts for road changes. Okay, a lot of stuff here, but actually in a way this is relatively simple. What they're doing, and I assume deep lane guidance means that they're using yet another neural network model, but they have course map data. So Google Maps, which is what they use, has a thing that says like, this particular road has 3 lanes plus a little right turn lane that's coming off here. And obviously the Tesla uses that for general guidance, but it didn't before this use it for the moment by moment driving. And so what it's saying is that it can sort of fuse what it can see. So right now it can see 2 lanes, but it can't see the upcoming right-hand turn lane, and it's got to make a right. So it needs to get into that lane. But what it's going to do is fuse the networks together. So it's going to be fusing together what it sees and what it knows is coming up from the Google Maps data. So it will be able to put that together so that as it arrives, or even before it can see it, it knows that that lane's coming up and it positions itself and it's ready to get into that other lane as it goes. So at least that's how I'm reading this, but that should actually make life a lot better, because one of the biggest problems is, I keep saying this, there's a short-term planner, which is the safety planner, which is like, don't get into an accident right this second. There's the long-term planner, which is the GPS thing that we see that's like the blue, thing that shows you where you're going to go. And then there's the midterm planner, which is the thing that fuses this all together. And that's the thing that's always been the problematic area. This one looks like it's going to take big steps to help with that. It's basically going to make this thing drive more like you drive, right? So every time you leave your house and you go through your neighborhood and you're basic, drive, the first part of the drive, you understand it. You've memorized most of what's going on. And so you can kind of do it without thinking about it. And this should allow the full self-driving stack to do more like that. And that will be huge. So we will obviously have to look at that. Chuck didn't really test that out because he just, did some turn tests and things like that. But it will be really interesting to see if he does, or if I get the software at some point, just, to do a longer drive, like go to work or something like that, and see if it's more confident and not like, oh crap, I've never seen this before in my life. What am I doing? So hopefully what we'll see is that type of activity. It will get better at what it's doing. All right, second one up here. Improved overall driving smoothness without sacrificing latency through better modeling of system and actuation latency and trajectory planning. Trajectory Planner now independently accounts for latency from steering commands to actual steering actuation, as well as acceleration and brake commands to actuation. This results in a trajectory that is a more accurate model of how the vehicle would drive. This allows better downstream controller tracking and smoothness while also allowing a more accurate response during harsh maneuvers. So harsh maneuvers would be like rapid lane changes or a collision avoidance, something like that. But basically what this is saying is that I guess their models before assumed instantaneous stuff, right? So it would say like, oh, turn right 30 degrees or something, right? Turn the steering wheel, that would be pretty harsh. Turn the steering wheel clockwise 2 degrees or whatever. And it was assuming that that was an instantaneous effect. It would automatically just go boop and it would be 2 degrees over. Obviously, with actuators and electronics and things like that, there is a period of time, might just be 20 or 30 milliseconds or something, but it will take time for that to happen. And so now what it's doing is it's modeling in the latency of these controls as part of the model of what it's doing. And that is a huge, huge advantage, because what it'll do is it won't have these little crazy, little microsecond or millisecond types of errors that are coming up. And because of that, it will be able to drive in a more smooth way. So, the first part of this, without sacrificing latency, blah, 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 blah. It's the second part that you should be interested in, right? This trajectory, this part. So that's what the important part of this is. It should drive more smoothly. And that's actually going to be a really, really big deal. Again, so you can tell that Tesla, a lot of what they're doing here is they're working the fine details. They've kind of got the big overall thing working, and what they're working on now is trying to make this work better in weird cases, to be more comfortable for people, less, scary for people. That's one of the biggest problems with full self-driving when I take other people on these drives, is that they're like, it's driving fine, and then it does something kind of jerky, and that makes people nervous, including me. And so obviously the smoother that you can make this stuff and the better that it can model the way the car is going to behave, the more smooth and confident the whole riding experience will be. So that's what it should be like. So that's great. Okay, then we get to, this is actually, I haven't looked at the 10.13 release notes in a while, and I'll put a link to that at the end of this because I assume those are wrapped up. But this is one of the ones that actually goes back and touches on 10.13 again. Improved unprotected left turns with more appropriate speed profile when approaching and exiting median crossover regions in the presence of high-speed cross traffic. In other words, Chuck Cook style unprotected left turns. And I'll show you some screen grabs in just a second. This was done by allowing optimizable initial jerk to mimic the harsh pedal press by a human when required to go in front of high-speed objects. Also improved lateral profile approaching such safety regions to allow for better pose that aligns well for exiting the region. Finally, improved interaction with objects that are entering or waiting inside the median crossover region with better modeling of their future intent. Whew, all right. All right, so let's go to preview. This is the kind of style turn here. So maybe if I put it up here, this is a little bit more easy. This is really cool. They don't really talk about this in the release notes, but Chuck noted this. There is like a wall thing now. It's like the creep wall. And what it looks like is every time you get the autopilot creeping forward, checking for visibility, notification, it pops up this wall, which is basically the car saying, this is as far as I can go before I'm going to enter into traffic. And that should give us users, it's not necessary for the car, but it should give us users some confidence in the fact that we know how far the car is going to go. We know it's not going to keep sticking its nose out further and further until it gets into harsh traffic. This area over here is the area that was being discussed in the notes here. And let's see if I can go back here. So, right, this is the safety regions for better pose that aligns well with this, modeling for the intermediate areas, stuff like that. So you can see here that the car will put itself into this median, but it won't put itself in kind of vertically or perpendicularly to this. So, right, the bad thing to do here would be to just drive forward because this median area is smaller than the car. So what the car needs to do is it needs to pull forward and then rotate slightly. So that would be the lateral motion. And it needs to pose itself so that it's already kind of going this direction, right? So it comes forward, it rotates, and then it waits for the traffic, and then it proceeds out. And that is a really, harsh thing, and it's had a lot of trouble. And Chuck Cook has had a lot of videos with the car having issues. Now, the drive that he did was, I think, at 5 o'clock in the morning, and so there was really very little traffic because it's 5 o'clock on a Sunday. So the car didn't have to stop in the median for it, but it definitely was behaving well. So anyway, this is all related to what I was talking about, what is in these release notes right here. So basically, it's got the pose correct, it's got the creeping behavior correct, but also, interestingly enough, it's got this optimizable initial jerk, which I believe just means that it's going to allow the pedal to be pressed harder. So in general, the car has been very, very careful about accelerating very smoothly. And in some situations, that doesn't make us comfortable as people who are riding in the car, because we're like, you got to accelerate, right? You got to be confident. You got to go out there. These cars are crossing at 55 miles an hour. When you make the move, you got to make the move. You got to get out into that traffic and go. So the optimizable initial jerk, which allows the jerk to be faster, in other words, to press the acceleration pedal more quickly so that you can accelerate faster to get out into traffic. So that should be a really, really big deal, and that should really help with confidence, because a lot of times you want things smooth, but there are times when you want that solid feeling of acceleration to know that the car is not going to be approached rapidly by cars behind it. So that's actually really, really cool. All right. Added control for arbitrarily low speed moving volumes from Occupancy Network. This is what touches on Ashok's talk, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail when I talk about his talk later on. But anyway, I just thought I'd notify you of that so you can, pay attention or keep an eye out for that video that will be coming later. This also enables finer control for more precise object shapes that cannot be easily represented by a cuboid primitive. This required predicting velocity at every 3D voxel, which is just... We may now control for slow-moving UFOs. So I have a feeling that that's going to have to be in the title or the thumbnail or something. Basically, 10.69 now allows control not for fast-moving UFOs that are just zipping across the sky, but if one crashes and kind of like putters around on the highway, the car will deal with it. And this really goes to what Ashok's talk was about, which was basically that geometry, he was calling it geometry is greater than ontology. I think actually the better word is epistemology. But anyway, I'll have to check the definitions just to make sure. But anyway, basically it's saying like, if the car says something is in this voxel of space, which is just a tiny little cube of space, then don't drive in it. It doesn't have to know what it is. It doesn't have to have semantic knowledge of that thing, which is the whole idea of the UFO and why Elon Musk many, many months ago talked about that. He said that the car should avoid a UFO that's crashed into the road, even if it's never seen anything like that before. So this is actually a very, very, very critical part of this release, is basically it's saying, I don't need to know what it is. I just need to know that I can't drive there. That's all that matters. And there's a lot more detail about this, like I said, that I will go into during Ashok's talk. But this is really, really important, and it will deal with moving objects in the road, so not just static ones. So you might imagine like a tire that's landed in the road, and this is a big problem for full self-driving up till now. There's a big old piece of rubber in the road, and the car's just barreling towards it, and it's like, woohoo, no problem at all. Right now, because it doesn't know what it is. Now what should happen is we should see that a tire's in the road. It should say, I don't know what that is, but I don't want to hit it, so I need to move over. In addition, if it's the tire just fell off of a car and it's rolling down the highway, so it's moving at the same time that that you're moving and all of this kind of stuff, it should also deal with that. So movable objects that are on the road, which is why it's saying it has to predict the velocity at every 3D voxel, which is just insane. And a voxel, if you don't know, is like a pixel in an image. It's just a tiny little cube and you fill space with that. So very, very cool. Anyway, like I said, I will talk more about that stuff when I get to Ashok's talk. Next one up, upgraded occupancy network to use video instead of images from single time step. So this is really, really big. So we've gone from using an individual image, right? So it takes all 8 cameras and it creates a 360 image. But that's great, but it doesn't really tell us about the velocity of things. What we want is we want video sequences. So that's really important. This temporal context allows the network to be robust to temporary occlusions and enables prediction of occupancy flow. Also improved ground truth with semantics-driven outlier rejection, hard example mining, and increasing the data set by 2.4x. So this means it's, if it was 100,000, it would now be 240,000, or if it was a million samples, it's now 2.4 million, whatever. Hard example mining, I assume, means that they're looking through the data set for hard examples, things that are difficult for the network to do that. I guess that's what that is. So anyway, and then semantics driven outlier rejection means that it's able to use semantics at some points and go like, that's not important. Maybe something like a bag, like a plastic bag in the road, that would be important to understand, because you don't want to try to avoid a plastic bag that's just kind of floating around on the road. That could cause much, much worse problems, right? If the car suddenly swerves into another lane on the highway, it's better for the car to just ignore something like that. So I think that would be something like a semantics based outlier. It would say like, that's a plastic bag, don't care about that. This is a tire, do care about that. So that's important. Temporary occlusions would be if there's something that's in the scene, but then like a car gets in front of it between you and it, and yet you still need to know that it's there. So that would be really important. Again, that's why video is so important to this stuff. And also occupancy flow. So again, Ashok talks about this, and I'll go into this more in the other video, but basically it's like things are occupied at an individual moment in time, and that's fine. But what is happening over time? Is this object moving in the same direction you are, or is it stationary, or is it moving crosswise to the way you are? Those are really important things, and the flow of occupancy is super, super important. So again, talk about this more later in the other video. All right, next up, upgraded to a new 2-stage architecture to produce object kinematics, e.g. velocity, acceleration, yaw rate, where network compute is allocated by order of the number of objects instead of order of space. This improved velocity estimates for faraway crossing vehicles by 20% while using 1/10 of the compute. So order of objects instead of order of space. Order of space is the number of pixels that you see in the scene, and that is very, very large. The number of objects in a scene, in other words, you semantically segment the scene out into things. And again, I've done a video on this. If you're interested, you can check it out if you're interested in that. But once you semantically segment a scene out, the number of objects in a scene is way, 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 way less than the number of pixels in that space. And actually, it's a 3D projection of that on top of it. So it's actually even bigger than that. So this is a massive, it's 1/10 of the compute power needed. And when you're trying to squeeze out every, flop out of this thing and get the best performance you can, reducing this thing by 90% is just an amazing accomplishment. So this is really incredible. Not exactly sure what the 2-stage architecture is, because they don't say what that is, but basically it's able to predict all of these things, what's happening in the scene and what's going on with faraway crossing elements and stuff like that without needing a ton of compute. So that's actually super, super huge. So again, for people who don't know this stuff, you're going to look at this and go like, what? But when people who understand like order of things, so order of n squared is much, much worse than order of n, for example. And here what we've got is order of much, much less stuff in the scene that we're having to deal with. So anyway, 20% improvement in its abilities while using 1/10 of the compute power. That is a win-win for sure. Next up, increased smoothness for protected right turns by improving the association of traffic lights with slip lanes versus yield signs with slip lanes. This reduces false slowdowns when there are no relevant objects present and also improves yielding position when they are present. So slip lanes is a term I actually had not heard of before, but I assume what that means is those little, you're making a turn and there's like that little thing that you merge into traffic. So there's like a little extra lane for just a little bit, right? You move into that lane, you move across, and you merge it back into what you need to merge into to get onto the road. So basically, I think what it's saying is it's understanding the difference between a yield sign and a right-hand turn arrow. So if you've got a right-hand turn arrow, it doesn't matter that there are people hanging out like right across the intersection because you have right of way. So the car is going to go whoop and just continue on and not slow down. Whereas if there's a yield and you see people coming towards you, you better slow down and stop and wait for those people to cross. So basically, it just means it understands now the difference between a yield sign and a right turn arrow sign. That's basically it. All right, next up, reduced false slowdowns near crosswalks. This was done with improved understanding of pedestrian and bicyclist intent based on their motion. So basically, I'm sure people who've driven full self-driving beta have seen people standing near a crosswalk or something along those lines, and the car slows down because it's like, ooh, are they going to cross? But obviously they're not going to. You can see that there's no intent of them walking out into the crosswalk area. So basically, they're just understanding, there's a better semantic understanding or kinematic understanding of whether a cyclist or pedestrian is intending to cross the road. So that's actually a really big deal. Fairly easy to understand though. All right, next up, improved geometry error of ego relevant lanes by 34% and crossing lanes by 21% with full vector lanes neural network update. Informational bottlenecks in the network architecture were eliminated by increasing the size of the per camera feature extractors, video modules, internals of the autoregressive decoder, and by adding a hard attention mechanism which greatly improves the fine position of lanes. Whew, that is a lot of stuff. All right, so first we can start vector lanes neural network update. So it turns these lanes from pixel space into vector space. So it's going like this is a lane and it's sort of a continuous object rather than a whole bunch of pixels. And what it's doing is it's improving the geometry by 34% for straight on, the direction you're going, and 21% for crossing lanes that are going in front of that. And basically they're telling you here how they did that. They had some information bottlenecks. They increased the size of the per camera feature extractors, which I assume means the early neural networks that are doing work on the cameras themselves. Then they put that together into the video modules. They improved that. They then also improved the behavior of the autoregressive decoder. And an autoregressive thing is it's a type of neural network. Don't worry. It's actually a type of training, honestly. It's a type of training for a neural network. And it basically, they improved the internals of that. And so they made it better. And then the hard attention mechanism, I assume that this is, in this case, using a transformer. And what they're doing is, I think they must be enforcing attention on certain elements rather than allowing the architecture itself to figure out what to pay attention to. It's sort of giving some hints to what the architecture should be paying attention to. Again, they don't explicitly say that here, so I'm kind of reading between the lines, but I think that's what they're talking about here. So I think this means they're using transformers, they're using autoregressive training, and they're giving some heuristics to say, like, you really do need to pay attention to this. You can't figure it out yourself. You need to pay attention to this. That's my guess as to what it is. I could be wrong about that, so definitely let me know if I am and there's a better interpretation of this. All right, next up, made speed profile more comfortable when creeping for visibility to allow for smoother stops when protecting for potentially occluded objects. So again, the creeping behavior sometimes is like, it's a little jerky. It like creep, stop, creep, stop, creep, stop. So this is about comfort. This is about making people more happy being in the car with this thing and it behaving properly and all of that. And so especially when it's protecting for potentially occluded objects. So that would mean, like, let's say you're moving forward and there's like a tree here and there might be a car behind the tree. So it can kind of creep around this and it can look for things behind it, and it can use time. It can use some temporal information to figure out if that car that was coming that's now occluded by the tree is probably going to pop out from behind the tree. So it just improves the overall comfort of the creeping behavior elements. So that's actually really good. Next up, and this is a big deal for me because I see an awful lot of deer and things like that in my neighborhood. Improved recall of animals by 34% by doubling the size of the auto-labeled training set. So first of all, if they had 1 million training in their training set, they now have 2 million. Notice that it says auto-labeled, so that's great. That means that they've got an auto-labeler, so human beings are not having to do this labeling. And again, if you recall, recall is all about false negatives. That means you're reducing the number of false negatives, which means that there's a dog in the road or a deer in the road or something and you don't see it. So you want to reduce that. False positives is not as bad. If you see something and you think it's a dog in the road, that's less bad than if you don't see the dog in the road, because in the one case you might stop abruptly for no reason whatsoever or swerve out of the way of something. That doesn't matter as much as, running over a dog. That would be a bad thing. So anyway, so this is really important that they've reduced the number of false negatives by 34%. Well, effectively, that's approximately what they did. But anyway, that's a really, really good thing. All right, next up. Enabled creeping for visibility at any intersection where objects might cross ego's path, regardless of presence of traffic controls. So this is interesting. This would mean that four-way stops, yield signs, it's going to kind of ignore that because it's going to pay more attention to whether people might be crossing your path or not. And I think that's actually good. That's the number one thing, because people can blow through stop signs or not behave properly in these intersection areas. And so for it to behave properly, no matter what the signs are, I think that's actually a really, really good thing. So yeah. So anyway, regardless of traffic controls, it's just going to take precedence over that. So I think that's important. Next up, improved accuracy of stopping position. This is interesting. In critical scenarios with crossing objects by allowing dynamic resolution in trajectory optimization to focus more on areas where finer control is essential. So this Chuck Cook's left turn is actually, I think, a good example of this, but there are many, many other ones where you kind of have to get yourself into a weird position in order to be safe in certain scenarios. That could be a slip lane where you're trying to turn. It could be putting yourself into something and then having to stop in the middle of the road because traffic in front of you stopped in the middle of an intersection, all of those kinds of things. So it's improving the rotation, I assume the yaw of the vehicle in critical scenarios where it needs to be in a good position and not be kind of goofily, like pointing straight when it should be pointing partially to one direction or another. So anyway, we'll have to see how that pans out in actual driving, but that's generally a good thing that it's able to do that. All right, we're finally getting towards the end here. Next up is increased recall of forking lanes by 36% by having topological tokens participate in the attention operations of the autoregressive decoder and by increasing the loss applied to fork tokens during training. Okay, so forking lanes are like that, right? So you've got a lane and it splits into two lanes. And basically, again, recall is that you're getting rid of false negatives. So it's seeing more of these forking lanes. It's not missing those forking lanes. It's very important that it doesn't do that, because it needs to set itself up, right? If it's driving in a lane and the lane forks, it needs to know which direction to go. It's like, well, I'm going to the right or to the left, and it can't like jerk back and forth and then figure it out at the end, which is to a large extent what it does right now. So anyway, the way that they're doing this is really interesting. They're using topological tokens, which basically means in 3D space, that would be like a median, some sort of triangular median, or some lines or something like that that indicate forking. So you can think about, most people think about tokens in terms of language. And so they say like a token might be a space so that you can tokenize words by just taking the spaces in between, right? So if I take this thing, here we go, improved velocity error. You can tokenize based on spaces and say improved is a word, velocity is a word, error is a word, because we've got spaces in between them. So we're tokenizing on that space. What they're doing is using topological tokens instead, which would be things like, like a triangular shaped median or a line that were indicating some sort of forking behavior or things like that. And they're increasing the loss applied to that. So they're using autoregressive decoders to do the training. And then they're saying, if you miss this, you get an extra big, but like boo or something. So it's increasing the loss that's associated with missing these forking tokens. So that's really interesting how they're doing it. But the upshot of this means that it should behave smoother when it gets to forking lanes. It shouldn't do that thing where it goes like that, which is a lot of times what it does right now. That should make life nicer for people who are driving this kind of thing. Okay, next up, improved velocity error for pedestrians and bicyclists by 17%, especially when ego is making a turn, by improving the onboard trajectory estimation used as input to the neural network. So somewhere early on in the path, it's doing trajectory estimation. And I guess maybe it's not using a neural network for that. Maybe it's just using some sort of like older, C type of hard coding thing to do that estimation. And basically what it's doing is it's particularly improving if the car is making a turn like this, because that makes it really hard. The whole world is spinning around you. So you've got to somehow remove the spinning of the world thing to understand what everybody is doing in this situation. But basically it just means that pedestrians and cyclists, it's going to do a better job of modeling how they're walking or driving or cycling or whatever. And so it won't be as jerky or potentially come to a stop or make mistakes in terms of their velocity estimates. So, again, generally a good thing that we're getting improvements in this. Next up, improved recall of object detection. So this would be detecting objects, eliminating 26% of missing detections for faraway crossing vehicles by tuning the loss function used during training and improving label quality. So first of all, better label quality, that's always a good thing. Faraway objects are really, really difficult because remember, we're basing this off of images or video sequences. But anyway, a faraway object could just be a couple of pixels. Like that car might just be like a couple pixels big. So it can be really, really difficult to model that thing until it gets closer, and then the car has to behave in a more aggressive manner to stop or something like that to avoid hitting that object. So it's good to be able to see these things better far away, but it's very, very challenging. Anyway, so 26% of missing detections for faraway crossing vehicles, that's really, really good. So again, recall is the false negatives thing. So we're getting rid of the false negatives by 26%. We're making this thing see objects that are crossing far away better. And that's really, really important. That should make the car behave. I drive a lot on these kind of back highways that have traffic lights and things, or just intersections that come out. So the speed limit is like, 55 or 65 miles an hour, but people can actually enter into the road at any point. And so it's really, really good for the car to be able to see them far away because we're traveling fast. And so even though they're hundreds of meters away, we're going to close that distance really quickly. And so rather than the car having to go like, and slam on the brakes really fast because it's like, oh man, that car is like really close in front of us now, it should be able to see this much further away, and it should do a better job of detecting that, which means that it can take steps to alter its behavior more smoothly instead of having to do it very, very rapidly. So again, should be a really, really nice improvement. All right, next up, improved object future path prediction in scenarios with high yaw rate, which is that turning behavior again, by incorporating yaw rate and lateral motion into the likelihood estimation. This helps with objects turning into or away from ego's lane, especially in intersections or cut-in scenarios. So again, this is not the ego car's yaw rate. This is actually the other car's yaw rate. So this would be like what you're doing is, and the rate of yaw is how fast it's turning. So it's not what angle are we like this, it's how quickly are we changing our angle, which indicates how fast the car is going to move into your lane or move out of your lane. That's the important part to this. So basically it's incorporating this into its lateral motion. So it's not just assuming that you're like this and you're going to continue like this. It's seeing that you're like this, but you're also turning. So you're going to turn much more rapidly, or you're like this. And so it looks like you're going to intersect my own vehicle's, path, but you can see that it's actually turning this way. So the yaw rate will allow the ego car, the car that's driving, to behave in a much more smooth manner because it will understand more what these other vehicles are doing by taking account of how fast they're turning. Basically, that's what they're saying. So really, really nice. This should help a lot in cut-in, cut-out scenarios where the car has to brake or not brake because the other vehicle is cutting in or out of your own lane. All right, next up, improved speed when entering highway by better handling of upcoming map speed changes, which increases the confidence of merging onto the highway. So this is a really big deal. This is one of those annoying things where you're getting on the highway and you know the speed limit's 65 and somehow the car is still doing like 35 or 40. That's what you can see the little registration at the top corner is going like 35 or 40 because it's not taking account of the fact that it's getting on a highway and it's going to be much, much faster speed. So this is great. So when it's on those kind of merging things, those entrance ramps onto highways, it should get faster much more rapidly and not have to merge at the last second and accelerate really quickly. So this should really help, right? Because the whole deal when you're merging onto a highway is to get up to highway speed as fast as possible so that by the time you're actually merging, you're going the same speed as all the other traffic and you can just slot into it. If you're going way slower than the other traffic, that causes serious problems because people have to slow down drastically to let you into this whole thing. So this should help a lot. This should make things better. Just the fact that it understands that it's going to be going faster in just a second will allow it to accelerate and get into the lane much more confidently. So that should be fantastic. All right, next up, reduced latency when starting from a stop by accounting for lead vehicle jerk. So this is actually nice. Sometimes what we get is you're at a stoplight and there's a car in front of you and the light turns, green and the car goes boom and they take off and you're like, oh, okay. And then you slowly speed up. And so you're creating this sort of gap between you and the car in front of you. And that's just, it's not efficient behavior. And it's also a little bit annoying to the people behind you because they want, everybody should kind of move at the same speed. So in this case, what it's doing is it's saying if the next person or if the person in front of you moves rapidly away from the stoplight intersection, whatever, that you can then accelerate more rapidly to follow them more closely. So that should actually, again, just a comfort thing. It's not absolutely critical, but it should make the car drive more like a human being. And then the last thing, finally, enable faster identification of red light runners. That means people who are disobeying the law, right? So the light turns red for people and then somebody, because there's always an idiot who's like, and just zooms through this light. So that kind of a thing. So the light turns red for crossing traffic and the car still needs to know if, somebody's going to ignore that and go through the red light. So anyway, enabled faster identification of red light runners by evaluating their current kinematic state against their expected braking profile. So essentially it's modeling the car. It's saying, here comes a car. Is it slowing down at the correct rate, right? Is it decelerating at the correct rate to hit 0 when it gets to the edge of the intersection where the red light is? If not, then I better just kind of sit tight for a minute, right? So I think that's basically what it's doing. If it sees this car coming at us, and even though we've got the green light, if that car's not slowing down, it's going to go like, nope, that car's not slowing down. I'm just going to chill out for a second and wait for them to run the red light, and then I will continue on my way. So that should be really good. That will reduce the probability of the car getting out into a situation where a person might hit them if they run the red light. Obviously the other person's fault, but the best accident is no accident. It doesn't really matter whether it's your fault or somebody else's fault. It's still a really bad day, especially if somebody hits you, like T-bones you in the middle of an intersection. So this is really good that the car is modeling what other cars are doing. And it's saying, if that car looks dangerous, I'm going to stop and just wait for that person to go through, even though I have the right of way, which is definitely the best behavior and really good for safety. All right, my goodness, this is a 35+ minute video, so I'm just gonna go ahead and end it here. I hope this was useful. Again, I'm going to do a video on Ashok Ellerswamy and his discussion about occupancy networks as fast as I can get it out. I think it's really interesting. It's one of the first updates we had in almost a year about what new things full self-driving is doing, and it's really fascinating. So definitely stay tuned for that. In the meantime, everybody have a lovely day, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.